Hello, and welcome to Books to Last, the podcast that challenges readers to pick the only 5 books they may take with them when cast away to a mystery remote location. As ever, I'm joined by a book-loving guest, and this episode I'm joined by Foluso. I'm so glad you've come on the podcast. How are you today?
Hi, Jordan. Lovely to meet you as well. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm great today. Looking forward to our conversation. I love talking about books, love writing books, and I'm just excited to talk about everything book related today on the podcast.
Amazing. That's exactly what we want. I feel like I've not spoken about books in an age because my regular book club has been snowed off thanks to our wonderful weather here in the UK
Oh,
at the
no.
moment. So I am really looking forward to this conversation. For the benefit of any listeners who might not be familiar with you and what you do, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and books?
Yes, sure. So my name is Foluso Agbaje, as Jordan has already said, and I am an author. I'm the author of the Parlour Wife. It's my debut novel. It came out in September 2024, and it's a historical fiction novel about a young woman set in Nigeria, 1949, during the Second World War. And she has to surmount a number of challenges to find herself in that time period. When I'm not writing, I probably spending time with my family, eating out at restaurants. I love eating out. It's probably one of my favorite things to do. Or just being in a bookshop or reading somewhere in the world. So that's me.
Amazing. Yeah, eating out is the best because you don't have to do the
Amazing.
dishes
Yeah, you
or
don't have to cook the food, dish the food. You don't have to clean your plates. Nothing is fantastic.
debut novel out. That's very exciting. Has it been everything you dreamed it would be in terms of the process? I know it's a long journey.
It's a very long process. And I was just talking to my mom today on the phone about how I've really learned how to be a patient person in this process, because most authors will tell you that between the period when you're writing the book and when the book actually gets published, it can be so long. And I'm really grateful because, yes, it was many years, but just so grateful to be at this point where I can actually hold the book in my hands. People can read the book. It's just amazing to be communicating with strangers who I will probably never meet, who I've been able to share the message in my book with. So it's been amazing in that way. I will still never get used to people sending me messages on Instagram or Twitter saying that they love the book. It's still very, I think, very scary in an amazing way that it's just gone so far. So I'm so grateful. And honestly, it's been everything I wanted and more.
I can only imagine because, yeah, all that stuff that was in your head and you've been living with for all these years, all of a sudden it's in the hands of other people and they know it too. And yeah, no, I can imagine that's amazing. When you've got like a years long process, you usually get so caught up in some individual milestones. It's not till you at the end and then you turn and look
Yep.
back at everything. You're like, wow, that was a lot.
It was a lot. And usually it was, I started writing The Parlour Wife in 2019 and it only came out last year, just to give you an indication of how long the process took between from the first stage of having the idea, writing the book, looking for an agent, then getting the agents, getting the publisher. And this is a very summarized version of what the process was like. So I'm just so grateful, honestly, that I'm even at this point in the process, and I'm looking forward to everything else that's to come with future books.
Right. I love the sort of historical fiction angle. I always find it's really interesting to talk to authors about their sort of research process because you tend to find a lot of I'll try again. A lot of historical fiction that I don't know. There's so many layers of research that you have below the book, and you maybe don't see them necessarily on the surface of the book, but it's all there behind. And I love that there's so much fiction being written now about less well known, well
Yes.
explored part of history that don't get taught, and there's such a big audience for it. It's amazing. So it's sounds awesome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I love historical fiction. And as we talk more on this episode, I'm sure you will understand that my love for historical fiction goes beyond writing it. I also really enjoy reading historical fiction. I think some of my favorite books have been in that genre as well. And that was big parts of the inspiration and motivation to write my first novel in the same genre.
Amazing. Like cannot wait to hear some of the inspirations. That takes us very nicely to talking about your 5 books. But before we get to that, you get to pick 5 book where you get to take your 5 books to. You get to pick anywhere to be cast away to, so long as you're there by yourself, anywhere you like. Where would you like to be cast away to?
I think I would. This is not a place that doesn't exist and it's not that remote now that I think about it, but I've never been to Australia and I always really wanted to go to Sydney. So I think I'd probably pick somewhere very quiet in Sydney. And this is probably where the fiction comes in, somewhere that is remote in the sense that I've got access to the city so I can visit, but nobody has access to me. So while I'm in there reading, it's just like glass bubble where I can see everything outside, but nobody can see me. And I've just mysteriously got access to all my favorite snacks and amenities, and I'm just there in my own little book world in Sydney, Australia.
That is the dream. I don't think until I became a mom, I don't think I fully appreciated the value and amazing brilliance of
Honestly,
solitude.
becoming a parent will do that
Well,
to you very quickly.
the idea I could have access to barista level coffee, but not have to talk to
Oh
anyone would
wow.
be amazing.
Small dreams or big dreams rather when you become a parent. Big
Yeah, drink the beverage while it's still hot. So yeah, always to add to your achievement list for the day. Okay, so we have a location, Australia, beautiful country. What book are you going to take with you first to your castaway
so
location?
this was very hard to come up with this list. I think the first book, this is one of my all-time favorite books. It's called Half of a Yellow Sun. You've probably heard of it. It's by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is a very, very popular Nigerian writer and has been writing for a number of years now. And the story kind of covers the Biafran War in Nigeria. So many people might not have heard about this, but in Nigeria, in Nigeria's history, there was a time when there was a civil war and there was an outbreak between different tribes fighting. And even though I grew up in Nigeria and I am very much Nigerian, I didn't know a lot about this period in our history. And reading that book was just such an interesting way to show how a war can affect human lives and has been such a big source of inspiration to me in writing the Parlour Wife. One of my, I've read the book so many times. I'm one of those people that will read books that I enjoy multiple times and still keep finding out more about the book. So I haven't read it in recent years, but I've probably read it in my lifetime at least 6 times. And plan to still read it a few more times. So that would be number one on my list.
A lifelong favorite is they always, and especially with like really good, the best books are ones that you take something new from every time. But I find every time I read it from a different perspective in my life, I'm then bringing a
Exactly.
different
Exactly.
thing
No,
to
that
it.
is the thing. That is the thing. Because I feel like I read it for the first time when I was in university. And then I read it again shortly after I got married. And then I read it again after I became a mother. And I think the next few times were in different stages of motherhood. And I was like, wow, okay, so this character, when she said this is really what she was feeling, or when that man explained this must have been what it was like. And it's just, I think that's the beauty of not just books, but also movies, any kind of arts, is how it can touch different people in different ways and even the same person in so many different ways, depending on what perspective you're looking at it from. And yeah, love that book. And I'll probably let me save it for when I'm a grandma, since I read it as a mom. So I'll save it for when I become a grandmother.
Yeah, it's really, you just find yourself related to all the different
Mm.
characters, and yeah, I know what you mean. Reading just completely different things out of the exact same words. It's just such a great experience, and I we talked about exploring lesser known histories. I find it completely mind blowing what is actually taught in history, not
Yep.
just like here where I, but like all over the world. And it's like schools specifically cherry pick like
Yep.
the least interesting part,
Why
and they
do
teach
they do that? Why? It's history is so interesting, but honestly, history in school is never as interesting as just reading it in a book or watching it in a movie. So very bizarre that it happens that way.
yeah, and but a good historical fiction novel, I think, will teach
Mm.
people about look history so much better than it can necessarily be taught in a classroom. Sometimes I feel like I don't know. There's a lot more it's empathy. You can feel the
Right.
actual people instead of it being far
Yeah.
off very textbooks most.
Agreed.
A really strong historical fiction book for the first hit. Are you going to stick with historical fiction?
I would love to say it's not, but then I'm looking at this list because I actually wrote I wrote them down, and in my top five, they are all historical fiction, which is bizarre. It's really bizarre.
Completely, well, not the first time it's happened. It's historical fiction. Different historical fiction, depending on the period, can feel like different genres. I feel
Yes,
because
agreed. And also
it
writing
kind of
styles as well, like different writes. So then the second book on my list is completely different period, completely different country, and it's The Other Bullying Girl by Philippa Gregory.
oh yeah,
One of my favorites.
I do.
I love that book. I read that one when I was probably in university as well. And I know everybody talks about King Henry VIII and his wives, anyone who's studied any kind of British history. And it's just so fascinating. And I think Philippa Gregory does a fantastic job, especially in that book, in bringing out the human elements of these historical figures that we've read so much about. Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, her sister, Mary Boleyn, who the book is really about. It was just such a fantastic way to see the human side of history that we all think we know. We've spoken about history we don't know. This is now history that we all think we know. Everyone can probably recite
Yeah.
King Henry VIII's wives. But like, what was the story behind it? And I just love that book. It's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, I know exactly. Philippa Gregory, I've heard a lot about, not an author I've actually read very much of. It's one of those authors, you know, when you feel like you have seen that name a million
Yeah.
times because you always see it on books and
Yeah.
shops, but it's just not something you've gone, and she's definitely that for me. But I find starting with maybe someone less known, like The Other Villain Girls are great. That's a really good time. I think that's presumably it's got quite a female
Yep.
feminist possible interpretation. Do you find that in your comes out in your own writing, or is that
It does. It does. Definitely comes out in my own writing. I think it's as a woman who writes, there are just so many stories that I personally experienced, and also the women in my life. Not, look, I'm like my lives, in my one life.
really like?
Only lived the one life. The women in my life have all experienced. And it's, I think it would be very hard to write a story that didn't reflect that because it's our reality. And it's just, it would be impossible, I think, speaking for myself anyway, to
Yeah.
write a story that didn't touch on the stories of the women that I've been privileged enough to have in my life.
Yeah, that's understandable because I think no matter how much people who write or create any kind of art try, it's impossible to extract your own experience and perspective from it, even if you really try.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think just part of being a writer as well is you writing stories means that you really just you do want to bring out stories of voices that maybe are not represented or not heard. The way a story kind of just burns in your brain until it's out there. It also lends itself to that angle of feminism where you want to speak up for the people who maybe don't have the voice to speak up. And
Yeah.
it really is such an honor and a privilege to be able to write women's stories in that way. So I never say never, but I don't think any of my stories will ever not have that slants to it. And the Parlour Wife definitely very heavily features lots of feminism. Not like I said, not intentional, but just happened that way.
Yeah. It's yeah, additionally powerful when it's historical women's stories because there's sort of women who have had their history, their story taken away from them in a way that they can't control it. So being able to bring that to light is really I had a really interesting discussion with an author at a festival, a literature festival, and to do with annotated copies of Shakespeare, but most of them were owned by women,
Mm,
and how they're getting their own they're having their voices heard even through hundreds of years by breadcrumbs they've left
that's
behind. And I think it's
amazing.
kind of that people are being able to bring those to light. Okay, so The Other Boleyn Girl, a sort of Tudor era.
Yep.
So there's a good mix of periods here.
It's a good mix, I promise.
I am all here for historical fiction. I will literally read anything if it's from a period in history that I'm interested in. And that just happens to be like the majority period. Anything like pre 1950, I'm
I
basically
know
there.
exactly what you
So
mean. Yeah, same here. I guess the next on my list is still historical fiction, but slightly different. So this is not Nigeria. This is not British. This one is set in ancient Egypt, which is one of my favorite periods. And it's called River God by Wilbur Smith. This is one of those books where it's sitting on your parents' bookshelf and you're not supposed to read it, but you do as a child. So that was this book. And it was just fantastic. It follows the life of Taita, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but Taita is a slave in an ancient Egyptian royal household. And he's just one of these really fantastic people. He knows everything. He's a eunuch. He's been castrated, so he has a lot of personal pain and issues that he had to surmount and get through to be where he ends up in the book. And it's also a love story as well. There's a bit of a love triangle in there. I don't want to give too many spoilers. This book it's such an old book. I read it when I was a child, but it's still, I would say, still really interesting and would highly recommend. Wilbur Smith is just such a fantastic writer as well. That the way he tells stories is so powerful. And again, he was one of the first historical fiction writers that I read and showed how it's possible to make history come alive in the way you write it on the page. I honestly, I haven't been to Egypt still to this day, and I still feel like I was there, like watching the chariots, sitting there and like beside the ancient pyramids, just from his beautiful writing. So yeah, that's that on my list. River God by Wilbur Smith.
classics are classics for a reason. I feel like I think everyone I know has gone through sort of an Egyptology sort of phase there because there's something just really riveting about it because there's so much we know, but also so much we don't know. And yeah, a book that manages to bring it to life in a real and touchable way. Authors who can do that, I'm always just in awe of kind of skill, especially when it's, yeah, I don't know, poetic language. Do not, I cannot even begin to think about how people
Mm.
formulate that in their own mind and then put it on a page because that's just a really amazing like little
Yeah.
passage. No idea how that comes
I
to
know some
to flip.
passages like that you read and you just have to stop for a moment and think, wow, like I need to let that sink in. It was just so good. Yeah.
And yeah, stealing books from but I used to try and read my grandmother's books and she was big into her murder mysteries, what could possibly not
Oh,
be.
ooh.
Again, it's just what you have to do. Eventually, you run out of stuff to read in the
Agreed.
library.
Especially if you're a child that loves to read. I think it's almost you become insatiable. That there's no amount of books that your parents can buy for you that will ever be enough. And
Yeah,
yeah.
amazing. That brings us to our sort of penultimate book, the second to last book.
Yes.
That's
Okay. So this one, we're going back to Nigeria with this one. And it's The Joys of Motherhood by Buchi Emechese, who, may she rest in peace, she's one of the most inspirational writers that came out in Nigeria. She was writing at a time when many people could only dream about writing, and she had such a great presence on a global scale. The Joys of Motherhood is a very sad book. And I think I need to read it now. Not, I haven't read it as a mother, actually. I read it probably twice before I became a mother, but it shows the journey, the life journey of Ego, who's the protagonist, from before she gets married to getting married. And she has a very challenging marriage and how she's able to push through those challenges. It's so sad. See her children, her husband. I'm not trying to drop any spoilers, but it's a very sad book, but just very powerful. So what I like about the book is not the sadness, because I do like to read happy books, but what I like is how it showed that journey in the protagonist's life from very early on in her childhood to be an older married woman, and showing the links that happened between this conversation she had with her father was what made her choose this man as a husband. And this is what led to the relationship she had with this child later on. It was just very masterfully done. And again, kudos to Puche Meshsa because she was definitely one of the earlier Nigerian women writers who set the stage for people like me who are writing now many years later on.
Yeah, it's always really moving to, yeah, experience the work of people who've laid the ground beforehand. But similarly, when I became a mother, I found it really surprising how much everything that had gone
Mm.
on in my life, she did actually really impact how I approached
Yep.
myself. And I found it really interesting how much people around me, but also books that I read, neglected to think about how, yeah, how you were brought up actually really does make it, as much as people want to think that it doesn't, it actually really does formulate how you approach it yourself. A novel that does that self would be really interesting. What sort of time period is it set during?
It's set in the, I won't say 19, I'm trying to remember, the 1960s. I
Ooh.
think it starts from the 1960s in Nigeria to sort of the 1970s. But I need to double check that.
Late. Yes, sure.
I need to double check that, but I think that is the time period. Yeah, it's been a while since I read that book, but that is the time period. I think it was in.
I will be interested to see if you have very different experience of it if you were to reread
I
it
think I
now or
would.
sometime.
I think I would. I think I would. In fact, I'm not sure I would find it as sad as I did reading it as a teenager. Because then it was just like, oh my days, like, what is this? What you going through all of? Well, I think now, like with the maturity that comes with having your own children, it's probably be like, oh, so sad.
I find that one because I find things like so much sadder as a parent than I did when I was
I do in some ways. Like it's the other day I was watching The Parent Trap with my children, and I started crying when this is so ridiculous. I started
yeah.
crying when the mom met Haley. I think it was Haley that got swapped back. And then I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine not seeing you guys for that long. And I just started crying. And they're looking at me like, okay, like it's really not that deep. So I do understand in some ways that there's some instances where I just feel things a lot stronger. But I also think
Yeah.
I I now have a different perspective. There's some things a bit more maturity with the way I see it. And I'm like, okay, not the end of the world. This is,
Yes.
it
In
was-
perspective, in the grand
yeah,
scheme of the
like
full.
things could be a lot worse. We're grateful we move on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good lesson to learn. Just to be perfect. I think, yeah, every now and then I do need to be reminded that things could definitely be worse. Oh, we have reached the last book
Ooh,
in your 5. I am really interested to see what rounds up because you've covered a whole bunch of themes. We've got stories, we've got feminism, we've got civil war and motherhood. I'm really interested to know what your last pick
this last
is.
one's a bit heavy, but it's such a beautiful book. And it's historical fiction, but it's probably been the most recently published out of my list of 5. And it's Homegoing by Ya Gyasi. This one is by a Ghanaian author. Homegoing is such a beautiful book. It really is about, in a nutshell, about slavery and the impact that can have across generations. So it starts off with two sisters, and it's written in such a beautiful way because it's almost written like a collection of short stories. It is a collection of short stories, but each story is descendants of one of the sisters. And the two sisters, one of them got taken off to be a slave. The other one stayed in Ghana. And you see how the lives of their children and their grandchildren and all their descendants impacted by that initial decision. Not decision, really. It's not like the one that was a slave decided she wanted to be a slave, but that initial, yeah. Well, it's just such a good book. It's really beautiful. And it's been really critically acclaimed. I think it's won a few awards. And it's funny because I went to Ghana recently, like 2 years ago. I went to Accra and I went to Elmina Castle, it features in the book. It's the castle where most slaves that left Ghana, which was called the Gold Coast back then, they actually left from that port. So they would be taken there and then they'd be held captive there for probably about 3 months before the next ship would come and then take them and then come back again and take more people. So I went to Elmina Castle and they still do tours and everything. And the tour guide was saying that it's interesting because since Homegoing, the book came out, they've had so many more people from America come and visit Elmina Castle just to see it in person. But it's a really powerful book. It made me think about slavery in different ways, just the long lasting impact across generations, where obviously today, many African Americans they would, in fact, it's very unlikely they would have met any ancestors who were enslaved. But the impact that that had on their ancestors is still being reflected in their current lives and their current existence. And it's just such a beautifully written book. Like, it's really good. Highly recommend. I know I said this for each of the 5 books, but it's a really good book.
List if that wasn't the case.
It's a very hard list to write. It's when people ask me to say my top 2 books or my top 5 books, that's when I realized I probably read too many books because I was like, wow, like how 5 books? You're asking for too much. This is too short.
Yeah, I'm like that when everyone was, what's your go-to recommendation? I'm just like, no, we need to take it. What do you like to
Exactly.
read? What have you
I'm like,
read?
just make the tea, make the coffee. This is a whole conversation. It's not a quick answer. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have a dialogue and
Yeah,
I'll pick one from of ones that I like of something that I think you will like as
exactly.
well. But um, homegoing is, it just sounds, book tourism, I think, is a really underrated power. I think people don't seem to understand how, when people love a book, how much they need to feel like close to the things in the book. And I think it's a really powerful way for places that people don't know very much
Mm,
about to actually have attention brought to them. But as well as that, yeah, I'm big on going to places where that I've read about, whether
me too.
it's a fictional thing
Yeah.
or non-fictional, and especially places that have got real historic pasts and everything. You can feel the weight.
Mhm.
I feel like having around historical sites going, oh, I wonder if so and so stood
I
here, like where
know
I'm.
it's seriously. And the thing about Elmina Castle is honestly, you can smell. It's bizarre. It's been years, but it still smells like pain. It still smells like despair. Like walking into those cells and standing there. It's just. I would highly recommend reading the book and then going to Elmina Castle or doing it at the same time. It's especially when you get to there's a gate called the Gate of No Return, and that was where slaves only went through that gate. Nobody ever came back. And it's by the water.
Mm,
And now there's like a whole market. The water's moved back
mm,
over the years. And there's like a whole market there, and people are able to walk and come through the gate freely. When you think about the slaves that would have stood there and seen a massive ship for the first time and had to get on that, and that was, the end of everything they had known. Just standing there and feeling the weight of that, it was amazing. It was honestly such an emotional experience and so peaceful.
yeah, and probably something that we get taught about slavery and the slave trade at school, but it's not necessarily a part of it that is really focused on in terms of just like the actual individual experience and how did the reverberations throughout
Mm,
generations, because it's huge, this huge myth, well, I say misconception, it's mass delusion that like one day one day Britain woke up and said, we're going to outlaw slavery, that
yep.
thing that,
That we started.
and then that started. It's like, I know we invented it, but we've decided to finish it. And it's the end now. And it never happened
Yeah.
again. And that's it being a factor in people's lives. And it's categorically not true. It goes without
Yep.
saying. But yeah, the fact that like, individual experiences are being brought to the fore, because that always seems to be the bit that gets lost. People get
Yes.
very into the sort of mystics and nuts and bolts of the like
Exactly.
macro impacts and ultimately what people live life in the context of their own experience. So it doesn't feel anything until it's applied to the individual.
Yeah.
So yeah, really worthy final pick for your top 5
Oh,
list.
thank you. Thank you. Especially as it was so hard to do. I appreciate the shout outs on that.
Would you mind just recapping all 5 so that people, if people are listening, they can maybe make a little jot so they can take all of your most high recommendations and possibly go to their local independent bookstore?
Oh, okay. So the first one was Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The second was The Other Bullying Girl by Philippa Gregory. The third was River God by Wilbur Smith. The fourth was Joys of Motherhood by Buchie Meshaza. And the fifth was Homegoing by Yagasi.
Brilliant. And you said it was a difficult list. Did you have any honorable mentions that you really
Oh,
wanted to
I
add, but you
do. Of course I do. Of course I do. I have very kindly summarized them into just three more books. Just three more.
I think the record is 13, so everyone who's got 3 is completely
Oh, wow. I feel very polite. Yeah, I stuck to the rules. Okay. So the three additional ones are Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo. Really beautiful book. Again, it has a similar, it reminded me a lot of Homegoing in terms of that intergenerational feel of this happened to one ancestor and this is how it manifested in the next person and how the stories all intertwined. And it really made me look at identity in a way that I had never really considered it. It's a beautiful book. Really beautiful book. So that's my additional one of three. The second,
Yeah, I've heard many good things about Girl, Woman, Other from friends of mine who have read it,
really good.
and yeah.
Highly recommend. It's really good. Second book is Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I just reread that recently and I love that book. There's some books that have the skill of reading like a movie. Like you feel like you're watching a movie as the pages are unfolding. And this book is one of the books I think does it so well. It felt like I was watching an old Hollywood movie, just unfolding and becoming a current day Hollywood movie. I can even imagine like actors and actresses that we know acting out the book. So it was just really, really nice. And it made me think, obviously celebrities have lives that we obviously know nothing about. And we think we know because we read so much stuff about them in the press, but we really don't even know the half of it. And it's just such a good book. I'm sure you've heard of it. This one's a,
Yeah. One of Taylor Jenkins Reid's
yes.
most loved. Not one of I read a few of hers, and it seems to be that woman has got like a million stories in her
Yes.
head, and all of them are very distinct, and they all give the vibe of something that they're all so
They
visual and in that
are.
way. So,
Gosh.
yeah, Daisy Jones is it. That's what a music documentary almost like those behind the scenes documentaries that you see about like, and stuff. You can see the sort of cuts to the different people in separate interviews. Yeah, no, I know what you mean. And I've heard that Seven Husbands of Only Hugo is very similar in its sort of mode, if that's the word I'm looking for. An interesting book about well-meaning people still not necessarily what they should be. Yeah. Interesting exploration of where intention sort of departs from actual results. It's an amazing list, and I love how it crisscrosses all across human experience and civilization and time periods. So you could get a real cross section of all of humanity from a particular list. But it's been so much fun being able to chat with you about all of these books and influences. Doing the list, did you find you could see, I don't know, inspiration or where all of your sort of preferences from reading and how that comes out in your did you find like a link between those? I yeah, could not agree more. Ditto all of that. I think there's a quote in my head and I'm gonna attribute it to George R. R. Martin, but I could be wrong. But I think it's something like the man who never reads only lives one life, whereas the man who reads lives 1,000. I feel like I'm saying George R. R. Martin, but now I'm like, is it Terry Pratchett? It's someone in that sort of sound. But it's very, yeah, very true. It's yeah, one of the things that I really want to impart to my children, which I'm hoping survive school because that seems to be when you have to get through that pinch point. But it's been wonderful hearing about the books that you love and hearing about your book. If you could let listeners know where they can find the Parlour Wife and where they can find you and any recommendations you might have, that would be amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to the podcast where all good podcasts are found. and followers only on Instagram because I have decided that I have outgrown most social media. And I put the last pod on there. Thank you, Felicia. It's been amazing. And thank you for listening, folks. And until next time, bye.